My name is Fiona Marsh, and the night they decided to destroy me was the night they made the worst mistake of their lives. I need to back up. I was 26 when I met my husband at a training conference in Atlanta. He was there representing his family's commercial real estate firm. I was there representing the Atlanta Fire Department, speaking on a panel about emergency response protocols in high-rise buildings. We sat next to each other at dinner. He spilled red wine on my sleeve and spent the next 20 minutes apologizing. I told him it was fine. He asked for my number anyway. I gave it to him because his eyes were kind and he laughed at his own clumsiness without a shred of embarrassment. His name is Owen Hartwell. I should have paid more attention to the last name. The Hartwells are old money, not the kind of old money that's humble about it. The kind that frames their net worth and how many generations back it goes, who their great-grandfather knew, what clubs their grandfather belonged to. Owen never led with any of that. He drove a used Jeep. He wore flannels on weekends. He called his grandmother twice a week and helped coach youth soccer on Saturdays. I fell in love with that version of him before I ever understood what came attached to him. His mother, I'll call her my mother-in-law, is a woman who has never once in her adult life carried her own groceries. She has a standing appointment at a salon in Buckhead every Thursday morning, and she refers to women who work in emergency services as the type who can't find anything better. I heard her say that at a dinner party 3 months after Owen introduced us. She said it loud enough for me to hear. Owen squeezed my hand under the table. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. His sister, my sister-in-law, is 4 years younger than Owen and operates on the assumption that being a Hartwell is a personality. She never finished her business degree. She sits on 2 nonprofit boards, neither of which she does any actual work for, and she spends most of her time coordinating what she calls her social calendar, which as far as I can tell means brunches and passive aggression. She decided she didn't like me before she'd finished shaking my hand. I was a firefighter. I worked 24-hour shifts. I came home sometimes smelling like smoke and adrenaline and protein bars. I had a scar on my left forearm from a ceiling collapse in 2019. I had calluses on my palms. I had a savings account and a studio apartment and a 2017 Honda Civic that I loved. None of that was ever going to be enough for the Hartwells. Owen proposed after 2 years. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was beautiful. His family paid for most of it, which I now understand was the first brick in a wall I didn't see being built. When someone pays for something, they think they own it. They thought they owned us. We moved into a house in Decatur. Owen's work was flexible. He could operate remotely half the time. My schedule was not flexible because fires don't reschedule. I worked my shifts. I came home. I cooked when I had the energy. I cleaned when I had the time. I loved my husband completely, and I was proud of my work, and I was, I think, genuinely happy. His family visited often. Too often. His mother would walk through her house and make observations that weren't quite criticism, but weren't quite not. I see you've decided to keep the kitchen this color. This couch is interesting. Owen mentioned you've been picking up extra shifts. That must be hard on him. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. My sister-in-law was blunter. She'd shown up to our housewarming with a gift receipt included in the cart, not even hidden, and said cheerfully that she wasn't sure about my taste. She said that in front of 7 of our friends. Owen talked to them. I know he did, because I watched it happen. I watched him say, quietly, firmly, that they needed to be kinder. And I watched them smile and nod, and then behave exactly the same way the next time. His father is a different story. Retired federal judge, a man so measured and deliberate that every word out of his mouth sounds like a ruling. He wasn't cruel to me. He was indifferent, which in some ways felt worse. Like my presence in the family was a clerical error he decided not to correct, the incident, and I call it that because it sounds clinical and I need clinical right now to get through telling it, happened on a Sunday in February. Owen had been called to Chicago for a deal his firm was closing, a commercial property acquisition that had been in negotiation for months. He'd been gone for 4 days. He was supposed to be back Tuesday. His mother called me on Saturday morning and said the family was having Sunday dinner and that I should come. No, would you like to? No, if you're free. A statement. I should come. I almost said no. I almost had a shift. I'd picked up coverage for a colleague, but she'd switched back and I was free, and I thought, for the 100th time, that I was going to keep trying, that this was my family now, and families took work. I drove to their house in Brookhaven. The house is the kind of house that has a name, or could have one. 6,000 square feet of antebellum architecture that his grandfather renovated in the 70s. There's a circular driveway. There are actual columns. My mother-in-law answered the door herself, which she only does when the housekeeper has the day off. She looked me up and down. I was wearing dark jeans and a button-down. I thought I looked fine, and said with a small, tight smile, "Oh, you came in that." I said yes, I came in that. The dinner table was already set when I came in. His sister was there with her boyfriend, a man named Thatcher, who has the handshake of someone who learned how from a YouTube tutorial. His father was at the head of the table reading something on his phone. 2 of his mother's friends were there, women I'd met twice, who'd never once asked me a single question about myself. I sat down. I tried. I asked questions. I laughed at things that weren't that funny. I ate the food, which was catered, because my mother-in-law doesn't cook either. The conversation turned to Owen's deal in Chicago. His mother said something about how proud they were of him, how the firm was really coming into its own under his direction. One of her friends asked when they could expect grandchildren. His mother laughed and said, "Well, that depends on how much longer Fiona wants to keep playing firefighter." Playing. I set my fork down. "It's not playing," I said. "It's my career. I've been doing it for 6 years." She gave me a look that I can only describe as amused, like I'd said something slightly embarrassing. "Of course," she said. "We just wonder sometimes how sustainable it is, for a family." "We don't have a family yet." "Exactly," said my sister-in-law from across the table, and she smiled. Something shifted in the room. I felt it. The temperature didn't change, but something did. His mother's friends went quiet in a way that felt rehearsed. Thatcher studied his plate. His father set his phone face down. My sister-in-law stood up and walked to the sideboard, which is where they keep the good liquor and, apparently, where she'd decided to hold her courage. She poured herself something and turned around and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a specific thing. "We've tried to be welcoming," she said. "We've tried to include you. But you don't fit here, Fiona. You never have. Owen deserves someone who understands what this family is." "He married me," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. "He chose me. He made a romantic decision," she said, "that the rest of us have had to live with." His mother said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. And then my sister-in-law. And I want to be precise here, because I want you to understand exactly what happened. She took a step toward me, and she said, "You know what you are? You're a charity case he picked up at a conference. You run into burning buildings because you have nothing else going for you. You are not a Hartwell. You will never be a Hartwell." And she threw her drink on me. Not on my clothes, on me. Cold liquid across my face and neck and the front of my shirt. I didn't move. I sat there with it dripping off my chin, and I looked at the table, and his father had looked back at his phone, and his mother was smoothing her napkin, and her 2 friends were staring at their wine glasses, and Thatcher was basically invisible. And I thought, not one person at this table is going to say a word. No one did. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I walked to the front door, and I let myself out, and I sat in my car in the circular driveway for about 4 minutes, and I did not cry. I'm not sure why. I think because the humiliation was so complete that my body didn't know where to start. I drove home. I stood in the shower for a long time. I called Owen and got his voicemail. I didn't leave a message because I didn't know what to say, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing. I texted him, "I need to talk to you when you're back." "I'm okay." "But I need to talk to you when you're back." "I'm okay." He called me back in 11 minutes. I told him what happened. I was calm. I was maybe too calm. He was not calm. I heard him breathing hard on the other end of the line. He said, "I'll be home tomorrow." I said, "You don't have to." "I'll be home tomorrow," he said again. Here's what I didn't know on that Sunday night. Sitting on the edge of our bed with wet hair and a knot in my chest, my husband had not actually been in Chicago. He had been in Chicago for the first 2 days. The deal closed Wednesday. He'd flown back Thursday. He'd told no one because, and this is the part I didn't understand until later, He'd been suspicious. There had been a pattern he'd noticed over 2 years that he hadn't let himself name until recently. Times when he came home early and things felt oddly settled. Times when his mother called too soon after difficult family moments, already knowing details she shouldn't. Times when his sister made references to conversations she couldn't have been part of. He thought, at first, he was being paranoid. He wasn't. Owen had been home since Thursday. He told his mother he was staying through the weekend for some meetings. He'd stayed in our house alone, working, thinking, trying to figure out what was real. When I texted him Sunday night, he was 7 minutes away. I didn't know that when I went to sleep. I found out Monday morning when he came downstairs with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me everything. He'd driven to his parents' house Sunday night after he hung up with me. He walked in without calling first. He has a key, obviously, and they were still at the dinner table. His mother, his sister, his father, the 2 friends, Thatcher. The dishes hadn't been cleared. His mother's wine was still in her glass. He stood in the doorway of the dining room and he said, very quietly, "I heard it." He'd gotten there during the conversation. He'd been in the hallway. He'd heard his sister's voice first, then his mother's silence, then the sound of liquid hitting fabric and skin. He'd stood there because he needed to be sure of what he was hearing. He needed to be completely certain before he walked in, because he'd learned, watching his family his whole life, that when you confronted them without being certain, they rearranged the facts before your eyes. So he waited until I left. Then he walked in. He told me his father looked up from his phone and said, "Son, this is a family matter." Owen said, "She is my family." His mother started to say something about my sensitivity, and he held up one hand and she stopped. He looked at his sister and said, "You will call Fiona and you will apologize. Not for my sake, because it's right." She laughed. She actually laughed. She said, "Owen, she's not." He said, "If you finish that sentence, I will not be at Christmas. I will not be at your birthday. I will not be at anything this family calls me to until I receive an apology that she tells me felt genuine." His mother said, "You're being dramatic." He said, "I love you. I will always love you, but I will not let you treat my wife like she is less than you. Not once more." He told me his father didn't say anything. Not one word. And somehow that was what got through to his mother, because she looked at his father, the retired federal judge who had never once failed to have an opinion, and he was silent, and she understood, I think, that she had finally gone far enough. Owen and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that Monday morning. He held both my hands across the table. He said, "I'm sorry it took me this long to draw the line." I said I didn't want him to lose his family. He said, "I'm not losing anything. They are." His sister called me that Tuesday. The apology was brief and clearly uncomfortable, and not entirely adequate. I thanked her for making it. I didn't tell her it was enough, because it wasn't, but I didn't need it to be. I didn't need her to mean it completely. I just needed her to understand that there were consequences now, that the dynamic had changed. There's a thing that happens in your body when you've been tolerated for long enough, a kind of low-grade tension that you stop noticing because it's always there. I didn't realize how much energy I'd been spending just bracing myself until I felt it lift. We spent Thanksgiving that year in Savannah, just the 2 of us, at a rented house 2 blocks from the water. We cooked a turkey that was slightly overcooked and played cards and slept with the windows open. It was the best holiday I can remember. His parents sent a card in December, an actual card, handwritten, from his mother. It said they hoped to see us in the new year. It said, and I read this part 3 times to make sure I was understanding it, that she recognized she had not always made me feel welcome and that she wanted to change that. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing she knew how to write. Owen and I are still in the house in Decatur. The kitchen is still the same color, a green I picked out from a sample book, the color of pine needles in the morning when there's still mist on them. I refused to repaint it when his mother commented on it, and I will continue to refuse until I personally decide I want a different color. I still work at the department. I made lieutenant last spring. The ceremony was at the station, and Owen was in the front row, and he cried before I did, which I will never let him live down. There are people who will spend their whole lives telling you what you're worth based on where you came from, how much money your family had, what your last name sounds like, whether your hands are smooth or rough. I've learned that those people are usually very afraid underneath the performance of it, because they have built their entire sense of self on things that can be taken away. A name doesn't protect you from a burning building. A club membership doesn't mean anything when the ceiling comes down. What I know how to do is walk into the worst thing in the room and stay calm and find the way out. I've been doing it at work for years. Turns out I was doing it at home too. The difference is, I finally stopped pretending the smoke wasn't there. I thought a lot about what my mother-in-law's friends must have looked like in that moment, sitting at that long dining room table, wine in hand, watching a grown woman get a drink thrown in her face and saying absolutely nothing. I've thought about what that silence cost them internally, whether any of them drove home that night feeling something uncomfortable they couldn't quite name. I think they did. I think most people know, somewhere underneath the performance of loyalty and social comfort, when they've witnessed something wrong. The problem is that knowing and acting are two entirely different muscles, and a lot of people have never been asked to use the second one. What happened to me in that dining room in Brookhaven was not a one-time explosion. It was the end result of 2 years of small decisions, theirs and mine both. Every time my mother-in-law said something cutting and I let it go to keep the peace, I was teaching her that the cost of cruelty was 0. Every time my sister-in-law dismissed me and I smiled anyway, I was confirming her belief that I had no standing to push back. I don't say this to blame myself. I say it because I'd had to be honest about my own role in a dynamic I told myself I had no control over. I had more than I used. And Owen. I've had to think about Owen too. Not with anger, because I understand now what it looks like to grow up inside a system and not be able to see it clearly. When you've been raised in something, it takes a long time to recognize it as a choice rather than just the way things are. What matters is what he did when he finally saw it clearly. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask them to meet me halfway. He drew a line. That's not a small thing. A lot of people love someone and still can't do that. There's a version of this story where I spent the rest of my life being managed and minimized and learning to take up less space at that table. I've met women living that version. You can see it in how carefully they choose their words around their in-laws, how they preemptively apologize for existing in ways that inconvenience someone's idea of what their family should look like. I almost became one of them. I was kind and patient, and I believed, for too long, that persistence would eventually earn me a place. It doesn't work that way. You don't earn dignity. You either claim it or you don't. What changed things wasn't the incident itself. What changed things was that Owen stood in a hallway and chose to be certain before he walked in. That's intelligence. Not just emotional, but moral. The decision to gather the full truth before you act. To not let the people you love off the hook, because confronting them is uncomfortable. He could have walked in and let them reframe it. He waited until he knew exactly what he'd witnessed. I made lieutenant last spring. I've run into buildings that were actively on fire, and I have found people in rooms full of smoke, and I have brought them out. I know what it feels like when your lungs burn and your visibility drops to nothing, and you have to trust your training over your fear. I know how to stay calm in the worst room. That's not something a last name gives you. That's something you build, year by year, call by call, the hard way. My hands are rough because I've used them. My scar is from a ceiling that came down and I got back up. I would not trade any of it, not for a smoother dinner table, not for an easier place in someone's idea of a family. The green on my kitchen walls is still exactly the color I chose.